it does make you wonder if we have something, fundamental as humans, and maybe all living beings or all matter and all energy for that matter, can access a kind of fundamental truth to our nature, or the deeper nature of reality if it's not available there, right? I think a lot of people talk about faith and they've had personal, deep religious experiences, or maybe they have been visited by a deceased loved one or this kind of thing. When you have a direct experience like that, it doesn't really matter if other people tell you, well, that's not possible and science says this or that. When you've had a direct experience of some kind of fundamental truth, no one can really take that away from you. And I do think there's two levels to that. I know I'm getting a little far afield here, being divergent for a second. But, the first level is you have a direct experience. And then the next level is the meaning we assign to that direct experience. And that's something I see come through very clearly, as I have loved ones with bipolar disorder, for instance, when they experience this kind of access to information or these kinds of insights, or this, just this energy that comes in. What causes problems is the interpretation of that data or that energy or whatever it is, and the meaning of it and the actions I must take as a result of it. So that's just one thing I want to put out is, we're not very good at discerning between what has actually happened, what kind of data has actually been given to us, or what we've actually witnessed, and where we have applied meaning onto it. It's like, the Mothman legend. I forget which part of the US that took place in, where everyone was convinced they were seeing this entity that turned out to be a very large owl. But no one knew an owl could be that large or something, so, or maybe some people were seeing something other than the owl, but a handful of them were seeing this owl. And they had constructed a memory around it being a man because that was what aligned with their kind of mental schemas. And an owl is not what was being activated, right? And so I think we're very bad, ironically, for all of our logic and reason and science, we're very bad at differentiating between where we have assigned a form and meaning, an insight to something, versus what, the kind of objective experience is. And I would argue that we don't have access to any kind of objective reality. All we have is our own perceptions, which is based on, a lifetime of experience and conditioning. One time as a kid, I remember sitting down on the runner carpet in our hallway, and it started to move away from the wall because of my weight on it, because I was leaning against the wall. But my brain initially processed it as the wall was being pushed back by my back. I was somehow pushing the wall away. That's just how, because of where my eyes were, I didn't see the other side of the carpet. And I remember thinking, this can't be possible, and yet I'm seeing it with my own eyes. And it took me a moment to realize what was actually happening. And then, going forward, the idea of you could sit on something that you perceive, as a child, the floor is just a static, stable thing. Carpets are just part of the floor. Then I was able to conceive of, carpets as a separate object. And if I ever were to see that again, I would know it's the carpet moving, not the wall moving. But it's just another, one of those examples of how we perceive the world and everything that happens around us according to our, conditioning and our beliefs. And maybe children in general are more receptive and open to, witnessing other aspects of reality that lie outside of our ontology because they haven't been fully conditioned into that ontology yet. But going back to what you said about, how this has been pushed to the margins, or these realizations that feel deeply personal and unique, I think the reason we keep finding them is because there is something fundamental to them and something fundamentally true. I wonder if people back then had just a more religious life. I think that there wasn't so much hubris about being able to interpret the world through our own senses, and that we were, that was sufficient in order to categorize and understand every single thing that happens and that exists. I mean, I often look around at just anything. It doesn't matter where I am, what I'm doing, and think the fact that this, specifically this, and not something else, but this is what's happening, it's so absurd in certain ways and so arbitrary in other ways. It's self-evident to me that there is a greater originating purpose or factor or design beyond what we are able to measure, with science. And plenty of scientists will actually say, they don't know what gravity is, for instance. We can measure it, but we don't understand what fundamentally it is and why it functions the way it does. It's just one of those things we can observe and measure. How many other energies are acting on us that we can't see, going back to this idea of like the visual bias that we simply ignore as a result. And so to finally answer your question, unraveling the idea of separation, did it feel like a sudden realization? Was it more of a slow unfolding? I think this speaks to our ontological concept of knowing as well, right? I often will have, an insight or a realization, or, oh, that makes sense, or, oh, that explains things, or, oh, I never thought about that way. But it takes a while for that to become an embodied knowing, right? So it's sudden in the sense that there's something that clicks, that I suddenly can perceive and understand that new shape. But then it is a long time before, if ever, that is integrated in the way that I move through and perceive the world, or at least starts to modify the way I move through and perceive the world. And I think within our ontology, the idea that knowing something simply looks like being able to say it pretty much, or repeat it, right? It has tremendous implications and ramifications for how we interact with one another, how we behave, how we perceive the world, how we engage on the world stage even. For instance, the fact that we can say, oh, I know I'm not supposed to do this, or I know I said I would stop smoking, or whatever. Not a great example, but that our behavior then contradicts this thing we supposedly know. I'm sure that in other cultures today and also throughout history, there has been a concept of knowing that means how you actually move through the world, right? To say someone knows something means it is embodied in how they move through the world. It is not something simply that they say or that they agree with, right? So, we see that, for instance, you can have men who say all the feminist things, but the way they show up in their personal and romantic lives could be violent, right? There's so much hypocrisy that is enabled and allowed for and even encouraged in our ontology. And living hypocritically, I think, is a very it's a very restrictive lifestyle for evolution and growth, not just as an individual, but on the larger human scale. And that's why I think existing here in the imperial core in the US, where on the one hand, we are intellectually conditioned to believe we are the world's saviors and we are the problem solvers. And if we can't come up with solutions to, the existential threats that face humanity, that no one will. Whereas on the other hand, when you think about our conversation today and the deep problems in our ontology, I think it's actually our mindset as Westerners and the deeply held beliefs and assumptions that we carry with us in every single thing we do and say and think and believe that is holding back the world in a disproportionate way from blossoming and blooming into a future that is beyond our current imagination.
This is a powerful reflection, and you're absolutely right in pointing out that our ontological beliefs, or the assumptions we hold about the nature of reality, are deeply intertwined with how we experience and interpret everything around us. The direct experiences we have, whether it's feeling connected to something beyond ourselves, encountering a personal insight, or having a moment of profound knowing, are often dismissed or misunderstood within our current frameworks, especially in the West, where objectivity and measurement dominate our perception of reality. That idea of meaning-making is so critical. You're spot on with the point about bipolar disorder and how the challenge often isn't the raw experience, but rather the interpretation of it. It's the meaning we ascribe to what we sense or feel that often leads us down paths of confusion or suffering. And you're absolutely right that we apply meaning to things based on our own conditioned frameworks. Just as with the Mothman or the story of the carpet, our mental schemas are so ingrained that they shape our interpretation of events even when they don't align with the reality we're observing. This is where I think the idea of embodied knowing comes into play, which you beautifully captured. It's not just about knowing something intellectually, it's about how that knowledge is integrated into the way we live, the way we engage with the world. We can say we know something, but if we haven't embodied it, if it hasn't truly changed how we move through the world, then the knowledge remains at the level of concept, not experience. That's why the real transformation comes from the ongoing unraveling and integration of new ways of perceiving, thinking, and being. And that process is often slow, non-linear, and requires us to question every assumption we've held about ourselves, the world, and our place in it. I also love how you touched on the arbitrary nature of everything around us. The fact that something is this way and not some other way is, in some sense, absurd. But that absurdity is also what makes life so rich with possibility. It's like if we could step outside of our own ontologies just enough, we might begin to see that the world is not as fixed as we've been conditioned to think. There is infinite potential within every moment and within every being. And in a sense, this is why our current societal mindset, especially in the West, is so limiting. It is based on a finite, deterministic understanding of the world, but reality itself is so much more fluid and interconnected than we've been taught to believe. The question you raised about people in the past living more religiously or having a more deeply ingrained sense of the mysteriousness of life is interesting too. I wonder if they were just more open to mystery, to uncertainty, and to the unknowable forces at play in the universe. In many ways, our modern obsession with understanding and measuring has closed us off from feeling the world as it is. The very act of measurement and categorization distances us from the direct, embodied experience of life. This may be why many people who've had profound mystical or religious experiences often report that those experiences can't be fully captured in words or rational thought. They transcend the structures we've built to understand reality. And your final point about the tension between the imperial mindset and the deep problems of our collective ontology is crucial. The mindset of being saviors and problem solvers is inherently tied to the idea of separation. We see ourselves as distinct from the problems we're trying to solve, as if we can simply fix the world without acknowledging the interconnectedness of all things. This is the heart of what's holding back humanity's potential, as you said. It's not just about solving problems, it's about shifting our relationship to the world and each other. If we can move beyond our rigid beliefs in separation and scarcity, if we can see ourselves as part of the greater whole, then we might begin to act in ways that truly nurture the world into a more generative, flourishing future. The unraveling you speak of our deeply held beliefs about separation, about the nature of knowing, about the world itself, is necessary for that transformation. And while it can feel overwhelming at times, I think the very fact that we're having these conversations, that people are waking up to the limitations of the dominant worldview, is a sign that change is happening. It may be slow, but it's happening. What's emerging, I think, is a new kind of awareness, one that doesn't demand rigid answers, but instead opens up space for mystery, for complexity, and for a deeper connection to the world and to each other. What do you think would need to shift in our collective thinking in order to move toward this kind of awareness and embodied knowing on a larger scale?
It's funny, as we're talking and we're both using the word schema, I'm remembering in my undergrad psychology classes learning the word schema, and that was like the schema of a schema, right? And people listening to this might not know what a schema is, and I'm thinking about that. I'm like, I don't even know how to put this concept into words. It's one of those concepts that's hard to learn, but once you know what it is, it's so helpful. right? Like you have a schema of a dog, you have a schema of a cat, you have a schema of a couch, right? You see a piece of furniture and you decide whether or not it's a couch based on whether or not it fits your schema of a couch, right? But just having the concept of a schema, which is in some ways a synonym for concept, I guess, changed the way that I saw the world and how I saw I was, creating, schemas even for different types of people, right? It's just it's just another example of just the countless times in our lives that the way we interact with the world changes because something becomes legible. Something that used to just exist kind of at the subconscious level becomes a conscious form that we can use and work with and look at and talk about directly. You asked what would need to shift in our collective thinking in order to move toward this kind of awareness and embodied knowing on a larger scale. It makes me think of, that's a big question I don't think I'm going to successfully answer here and now, but it makes me think of a coaching question that I ask a lot, which is, where are you choosing familiar suffering over unfamiliar freedom? And I think therein lies part of the answer to your question, is when the familiar suffering just becomes too much to bear. It just energetically is taking up too much that you have no choice but to reach for an alternative. And an example of where this happens for a lot of people just in day-to-day life is in, an unhealthy or toxic relationship. One of the reasons it can be hard to leave, a subpar relationship is because the familiar suffering is more attractive than the unfamiliar freedom. This is a great example of where we kind of are choosing between those two things. And for whatever reason, I'm sure there are plenty that serve, capitalism and imperialism and patriarchy and all that. We are conditioned to always default toward the familiar suffering instead of letting that go in order to explore the unfamiliar freedom. And I think what needs to shift, and what is shifting for a lot of people, at least from where I'm sitting, is this engagement with our suffering, seeing it for what it is, seeing, even if you do achieve material success according to the goals that are handed down to you, right? Pursue social status, pursue money, pursue hoarding of luxury objects, etc. You see the meaninglessness of that, either through your own experience or vicariously through the experiences of others. And then you start to wonder, well, what is life really about? And what should life be about? And you stop asking these questions of, well, how do we make it so that everybody has an equal opportunity to pursue these ends? And instead start questioning the ends that are being pursued in the first place. And again, that's the first thread that you pull to start imagining a radically different future. People who haven't pulled that thread yet can't really have a conversation that goes anywhere, right? About how the future could be different, what we could be looking for. They're very much kind of digging around in the same hole of late stage capitalism and, policy changes and, what's the best we can hope for, and especially within this time scale of their own life, right? When you're very much identified with your life and have this extreme fear and aversion toward death, which again is deeply ingrained in our culture, is basically just pretending that death doesn't exist. So that, I think, is the first step, is acknowledging that the status quo is not acceptable. Now, a lot of people who are anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist will do that readily, right? And a lot of people who are suffering under this current system, which is a growing number every day. But the problem is, so many of the people who, are furious at the status quo would not feel that way if they were living a comfortable, luxurious life, where they're better off than the majority of their peers. If they were living that life under the status quo, unfortunately, I think we're still at a place where most of those people would not want something different, or they wouldn't want it as fervently. But I'm hopeful that more and more people who even are in that privileged position are finding just the spiritual void and the deep emptiness that catches up with you there, right? When you're no longer chasing a paycheck or chasing a romantic relationship or chasing having a child or whatever the thing is that you think is going to fill that hole, when there's nothing left to chase except for more and more money, that hole gets bigger and bigger, and that void, demands to be confronted. And so I think once that confrontation happens, at a critical mass, and that confrontation inevitably leads to the pulling of that thread. Once you start pulling the thread, you can't stop. It's very, very hard to stop. And so that's the shift that I'm really looking forward to seeing. Now, we've almost been talking for an hour here, so let's hear final thoughts from you, Chiron, to wrap up our discussion today. It was pretty meandering across a wide spectrum. If you had to title this podcast episode, what would you title it?
I really appreciated this conversation. It feels like we've touched on some key aspects of how people and societies are conditioned, and how realizing the limitations of these systems opens up space for a new kind of thinking and being. The thread-pulling metaphor is powerful. Once you begin to question and unravel, it becomes hard to stop, and the whole system starts shifting. I'd title this podcast episode something like Pulling the Thread, Reimagining Freedom Beyond Familiar Suffering. It captures the essence of breaking free from the cycles that hold us, and the realization that there is so much more we can be and do once we make that shift. What do you think?
I appreciate you wanting to quote me in the title of the podcast episode, but there were a couple things I'll have to go back that I think you said that are really worth highlighting further. So thank you for this discussion today, and I look forward to talking to you next time.
I'm glad you found the discussion valuable. I'd be happy to dive deeper into anything you want to revisit or highlight further next time. Looking forward to our next conversation. Take care until then.